Our center, together with IBC Bank and Commerce Bank, brings speakers to speak about topics in the areas of international trade, economics, finance, demography, and immigration. Before introducing today's speaker, I'd like to thank our sponsors for the event, for supporting this event, IBC and Commerce Bank. With their support, we've been able to bring many thought-provoking speakers throughout the years to TAMIU and Laredo. I'd also like to do a little bit of housekeeping for the students who are here. At the end of Mr. Griswold's presentation, there'll be a question and answer session. We'll take questions from the audience in attendance here today, and I see we have a nice attendance today in person, but we can also take questions from participants online. So for those in attendance, please raise your hand, and one of our student workers will bring you a microphone and you can ask your question. If you're attending virtually, what you can do is you can submit your questions through the Q&A box and in WebEx, and then we'll try to address as many of these questions as possible. So we'll read out the questions for Mr. Griswold so he can answer them. Again, for students attending in person on behalf of one of your classes, you should have had your student ID scanned at the door. In addition, you were provided with a QR code that will take you to an online form where you will submit your class information. Finally, you'll scan your ID when departing from the lecture after the lecture has ended. And for students attending online, your class information should have been submitted during the registration process for the class, for the talk. So thank you all for joining us, both in person or online. For those of you who are online, we have quite a full lecture hall here. And for those of you in person, we have about 120 people so far online, although I'm sure a few more will show up as the day goes by. Today's speaker is Daniel Griswold. Daniel Griswold is an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute specializing in trade and immigration policy. He's a former director of the Center for Trade Policy Studies at Cato and former co-director of the Trade and Immigration Project at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. From 2012 to 2016, he served as the president of the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones. He's the author of a Cato Institute book, Mad About Trade, Why Main Street America Should Embrace Globalization. He has also authored numerous studies on immigration and trade, testified before Congress, appeared on many news programs, and written articles for newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal and the Los Angeles Times. So thank you very much, Mr. Griswold.
Thank you very much, George, and thank you all for coming tonight. It's a real pleasure to be back here at TAMIU. I believe this is my fourth visit to your fine institution, and being somebody who has studied and talked about trade and immigration in Washington for close to 25 years now, this place is Exhibit A. This is a wonderful living example of the benefits of trade and immigration and how the border should function. And I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. I love coming to Texas as well. Texas has an outsized influence on the United States. I also like the music and the food and the barbecue. My wife and I actually spent a month traveling through Texas last year in an RV. And we saw a lot of this from one side to the other, 1,200 miles. Austin, San Antonio, Big Bend National Park. I hiked to the top of Guadalupe Peak. And in Big Bend, I actually waded into the Rio Grande and went up the Santa Elena Canyon about half a mile and wandered over to the Mexican side and back to the American side. So I've got an idea of what it is to cross the border. One evening, we were in Presidio, Texas, and we had our passports, and I said to my wife, why don't we cross over to Ojinaga, where they have a lot more restaurants, and have dinner? And it was a nice 10 minutes across the bridge over there. We had a very pleasant dinner over there. It was 3 hours and 40 minutes to get back across the bridge here. And I think there I learned a lesson in the dysfunction of the border, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that as our evening goes on. Well, I don't need to tell you all. I'm just going to put this on to make sure the time is right. We are at a time of challenge for our nation with COVID, with international policy, economic policy. In our time together tonight, I want to make the case that American workers first have done relatively well in our economy in the last 30 years, in a more open economy with more immigration. I want to counter some of the pessimism that's out there. But then I want to talk about one of the challenges, and that is a demographic challenge we face in this country, and why immigration is a big part of the solution, a prescription for that. And then I want to talk in more practical terms about reforming our immigration system to serve our nation's needs into the future, including our foreign policy challenges and our confrontation with other superpowers in the world who don't share our values. And I know all this has very special interest to those of you here in the Rio Grande Valley. Well, we all know the U.S. economy is still recovering from COVID-19, and that has left some lasting effects on our economy and our society. And we're also struggling right now with a very grave foreign policy challenge, aren't we? With Russia having invaded a sovereign nation, the Ukraine. We see that on TV every night. You're seeing the same images that I see. We have issues with inflation, supply chain challenges, and worker shortages. Texas is one of a minority of states that has recovered all the jobs that were lost during COVID. And that is something that the rest of the nation is kind of waiting to catch up to Texas, which happens occasionally, doesn't it? But the U.S. economy is performing reasonably well as we shake off the effects of COVID. Unemployment is below 4%. GDP growth has resumed again at a significant pace. Workers are in a position to hold out for better wages in their jobs, so there are some good things going on. Meanwhile, U.S. trade and immigration is stuck in limbo. Washington is not making progress on those issues. President Trump was not a supporter of a more open U.S. economy, but I have to say President Biden has not done much to undo some of those policies that his predecessor had implemented. Trade restrictions remain on steel, on solar panels, on goods imported from China. President Biden has no plans to rejoin what was called the Trans-Pacific Partnership that also includes Japan. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement negotiated by the Trump administration did preserve the core of NAFTA, duty-free treatment on goods, but NAFTA has served the nation well and the people of Texas and Laredo well since its implementation. USMCA, I think the biggest fault of it is that it tightened the rules of origin on automobile and light truck production, including a 45% requirement that parts be made by workers earning $16 or more an hour. I call that the No Mexicans Need Apply provision. It's not only discriminatory against our neighbors in Mexico, but it reduces the efficiencies of an integrated production platform here in North America. Unfortunately, again, the Biden administration hasn't addressed that. In fact, they have tightened those rules of origin rules. On immigration, the Biden administration has certainly talked a better game than the Trump administration, but they've done very little to reverse the policies of the past few years, and that includes the Trump administration, I think, taking advantage of COVID to reduce student visas, to reduce high-skilled temporary worker visas and lower-skilled visas, and to put a hold on a lot of green cards that should have been approved for immigrants who are waiting for permanent legal status. The result was a dramatic drop in net migration in 2019 and 2020. Some of you may have seen it. President Biden said positive things about immigration in his State of the Union address last week, but again has proposed very little. Frankly, we seem further away from any kind of real immigration reform than at any time in the last 20 years. But I'm going to talk about some ways we might get back on track on that. Well, first, trade and immigration often get caught up in a larger debate about how American workers have fared during a time of increased trade and immigration to the United States, broadly globalization. Critics on the left and the right argue that even before COVID, American workers were losing ground, stagnant wages, stagnant incomes, lost jobs in manufacturing. In the State of the Union, President Biden even said that Americans have suffered lower wages over the last 40 years. Well, I want to challenge that more pessimistic view. Yes, there we go. Here's a study I did for the Mercatus Center, Fail or Flourish, American Workers, Globalization, and Automation. I looked at this broad question about how American workers have fared during this time of greater globalization. First, let's consider real average wages. This is a metric that a lot of people talk about. And critics claim that real wages have been stagnant since the 1970s. And here's a chart. It's a common series, and it seems to bear that out, doesn't it? Since the early 70s, we've only regained what real wages were in the early 1970s. But this is misleading for a couple of reasons. One, you notice the trend was down, and then we turned a corner in the 1990s, and real wages have actually grown, according to this measure, by 21% since the mid-1990s. What happened in the mid-1990s? Congress approved NAFTA. We approved the World Trade Organization. We started to dramatically ramp up our trade with China, and real wages increased. I think right there, that tends to undercut the narrative about real wages. I think one of the problems with this series is that we mismeasure inflation. We tend to overstate inflation. We do have a problem with inflation today, but over a period of decades, we have tended to overstate inflation for a number of reasons. One, we don't do a very good job of taking into account new products, iPhones and things like that, smartphones. We don't account for the increased quality of goods during that time, automobiles and personal electronics. We don't account for changing consumer patterns as prices change, discounts offered by big box retailers. If you follow called the personal consumption expenditure deflator, which is better captures some of these phenomenons, you see that real wages have actually, over the last 30 years, been growing at 0.5% to 1% and not stagnating. And that doesn't include benefits. About 30% of the compensation for American workers is benefits, and we need to include those. Health insurance, other things like that, retirement benefits. This is a series that is called Total Real Compensation. And this has a better deflator that more accurately measures inflation. It includes benefits. And there you see the trend. There's a few bumps along the way, but it's headed upward. American workers are doing better than they were 10, 20, or 30 years ago, and trade and immigration is a big part of it. It's the same with real median household income. Again, it's a bit of a bumpy ride with recessions, but the trend is up. And again, if you use a more accurate deflator, if you adjust for household size, households were bigger 30 or 40 years ago, so you have more income shared by actually fewer people. So they're actually even better off than this would show. And if we take into account non-wage and benefit things like worker safety, because we've moved from more to a service economy and away from a manufacturing and natural resources economy, deaths in the workplace, the rate of deaths in the workplace are down 30% in the last 30 years. Workplace injuries down 69% You not only get better compensated, but you're safer when you go to work. So remember some of these more positive things. Now, we do hear in the last 30 years, we've lost 5 million manufacturing jobs. You hear that all the time. You can ask me about that later. I've got more to say about that. But one thing we need to keep in mind, during those same 30 years, our economy has created 20 million better paying jobs, new jobs in the service sector. These are in business and professional services, financial activities, management, healthcare, education. I just want to say to all you TAMU students, there are good jobs. Study hard, do what your professor says, but there are good jobs waiting for you out there. I would be optimistic about your future. None of this is meant to paint a rosy picture that everything's great for all American workers. Clearly, some people have been left behind, but I think the challenge is, let's help those people who have been left behind for various reasons. Opioid addiction, too much government regulation in occupational licensing and housing, which makes it difficult for people to move. Too many people incarcerated. Let's have criminal justice reform. Let's do those things to help people that have slipped through the cracks while letting the engines of growth, trade, immigration, investment, innovation move forward. That's the answer to the future. Well, I'm going to now focus on one of those, immigration, which I know is a great here in Texas and Laredo. And it's a key policy issue for the United States as we confront both our economic challenges and our foreign policy challenges in the future. One of the reasons we need to expand legal immigration is America's demographic challenge. Again, Texas is the third fastest growing state. Between the 2010 and 2020 census, you added 4 million people here in Texas, picked up 2 congressional seats. But again, Texas is the exception. We had very slow growth over the decade. Year to year, from July 2020 to July 2021, we had the slowest population growth in our nation's history. I think COVID-related. It's going to pick up, but this is still a huge issue. I'll just mention another Cato study I did. You can find these all online, of course. Immigration, the prescription for America's demographic decline. And in here, I discuss the negative repercussions of this decline for our nation's prosperity, for our fiscal stability, and for our influence in the world. Now, it's just basic math. 3 factors determine the growth of our population: births, deaths, and net migration. It's the only 3 ways you can affect the growth of the population. COVID accelerated all 3 of those. We've had about 1 million extra deaths over the 2 years of COVID. We're basically experiencing a triple whammy of rising deaths. COVID affected the birth rate in the United States. There were fewer births than demographers expected. And as I pointed out a moment ago, shrinking levels of net migration. You can see it all coming together in this population chart. The lower part is natural population growth and net migration. They're both heading down. And this was through 2019, so this is pre-COVID. COVID accelerated that down even more. So we're fighting some long-term trends. For various reasons, modifying the death rate and the birth rate are challenging for government officials. The one policy lever that we have to counter our demographic decline is immigration. We need to focus on that. So what's behind the demographic decline? Well, one, a steady rise in deaths, and this is somewhat normal. We have an aging population, but about the 1 million extra deaths because of COVID accelerated that. We have a declining birth rate, and that is driven by a declining number of births, and that is driven by a steady decline in the birth rate. The total fertility rate is a number that childbearing women can expect to have on average over their lifetimes. 2.1 is what you need to maintain a steady natural population. That was 3.5 back in the 1950s when baby boomers like me were born. It has declined below 2.1 for a number of years, and last year it reached a record low of 1.64, well below the replacement level. That is a record low. The fertility rate has declined faster than most estimate. The Social Security Administration looks at this number very closely, right? Today's babies being born are going to be the taxpayers of the future that are going to pay for the retirees, even older retirees. The Social Security trustees have assumed a fertility rate of 1.95 in their central forecast, way above the current rate. Even their more pessimistic scenario assumes 1.75, and we're already below that. And there's no reason to think the birth rate is going to bounce back here in the United States. There was a very important article in 2020 in the Lancet publication. I'd urge you all to take a look at it. They made projections of the total fertility rate, not only in the United States, but virtually every major country in the world. And they determined that actually the US rate is probably going to drop to 1.53 per woman, which is well below replacement. It's going to accelerate the demographic decline. That's far below not only the Social Security assumptions, but below the Congressional Budget Office assumptions. It's below the Census Bureau's assumptions and the UN population estimates. The two most important variables in the birth rate, their access to birth control and the educational level of women. Both of those are not going to change in the foreseeable future. And so that they account for 80%, explain 80% of the fertility rate. So I think that total fertility rate is going to stay very low for the foreseeable future. What this means is that the US population, we're at about 332 million now. In 40 years, it's going to peak, they estimate, at 364 million, and then start declining back to our current level and perhaps even below. So within your lifetimes, we're going to have a shrinking, most of your lifetimes, we're going to have a shrinking population here in the United States. Somebody might ask, so what? Why does it matter that we have a demographically healthy, growing population? Well, one, a larger population means a larger domestic economy, more economies of scale, more opportunity for entrepreneurs to sell into their domestic market, more specialization for firms and workers. Growth also means a younger population, generally. And younger workers tend to be more, how should I say it, innovative. They create more new ideas. They're more likely to found new companies and generate new ideas. Without immigrants, our economy will be less productive and less dynamic. Immigrants allow important sectors of the US economy to grow, both high-skilled and lower-skilled workers, immigrant workers. It applies. Immigrants are more likely to be of working age than native-born Americans. They're more likely to participate in the labor force than native-born Americans. On the higher end, the immigrants are more likely to start high-tech startup companies. They're more likely to file patents than native-born. And by the way, at least the first generation of immigrant families have a higher fertility rate, so they help to bump up the fertility rate as well. Here's a very, very important chart, and this explains the potential growth rate of the US economy. And there are two basic factors there, the growth of the labor force and then the productivity of those workers within the labor force. And you see that both of those are in long-term decline. The labor force, for all the reasons we talked about, productivity can rise and fall, sometimes depending on innovation, but that is also decreasing. Immigration is a twofer. By definition, it increases the workforce, but for all these reasons, it also increases our overall productivity. It makes native-born workers more productive because of their entrepreneurial spirit, because of product innovation. The International Monetary Fund in a recent study concluded immigration significantly increases GDP and per capita in advanced economies. Demographics also profoundly affect the health of U.S. fiscal programs, in particular retirement programs, Social Security, and Medicare. And it's pretty intuitive. If you have fewer workers coming into the system, that's fewer workers paying for retirement benefits, and that means more strain on the system. You know, the Social Security Retirement Fund, the trust funds that have supported that, the IOUs that were built up over decades, amounting to about $2.7 trillion, they are going to run out in 2034. It's not that far away. And if nothing is done, I don't know if many of you know this, it was a revelation to me when I found it out not too long ago. If nothing is done, benefits are automatically cut to meet revenues. And that would mean about a 24% cut in Social Security benefits in 2034. If no changes are made to the system. Well, obviously, Congress is going to do something. It looks like later rather than sooner. That's kind of what they do, put off hard decisions. But when they finally get around to addressing this problem, it's going to be a combination of two things, right? They're going to have to cut from benefits. They're going to have to raise taxes on younger workers. The Social Security trustees have estimated that if they have different scenarios of immigration. The lower one is about 900,000 a year. The higher one is 1.6 million immigrants per year. If we go from the lower one to the higher one, it takes care of about 1/7 of the funding gap. It doesn't fix the problem, but it fixes 1/7 of the problem. So I think that is one more argument for immigration reform. Without immigration, we're going to have higher taxes on younger workers, and we're going to have to cut the benefits of Social Security retirees by even more. Finally, and this is sadly very relevant today, a more robust population increases America's influence and heft in the world. It's an advantage we have over our two chief geopolitical rivals, China and Russia. A large and growing economy makes America a more important player in the world. We have more soft power in the world. It creates a larger tax base to fund the military. It also enhances our strength compared to those two chief rivals, China and Russia. The crisis in the Ukraine is a stark reminder that both Russia and China are nuclear-armed powers with authoritarian governments that are opposing our interests around the world. They do not share our democratic and broad sense liberal values that we have here in the United States. In fact, one of the many advantages we retain is a healthier demographic profile. Despite all the problems I've talked about, the birth rates in China and Russia are even lower than they are in the United States, down towards 1.5. And for both of them, a declining population and, more importantly, a declining workforce is a big liability for both countries. And by the way, you have fewer young men enlist in the military as well if you have a declining population. For all the reasons we've discussed, both of them will face a loss of dynamism, rising costs to support an aging population, and an eroding tax base to support their militaries. Immigration is our ace in the hole in this great superpower rivalry. It's a way for us to retain our edge. There was an important book published a few years ago called Empty Planet by Bricker and Ibbotson, and they came to this conclusion. Of the three global nuclear superpowers, only America will be growing its population during the present century, provided it continues to take in newcomers. That's an important qualification to that, which brings us to my final topic here, immigration as the key to growing America's workforce. As I mentioned, it's difficult to change the death rate. It's difficult to change the birth rate. Not sure I'd want government to do it if it could. The only one of the three variables of population growth that can stem the ongoing demographic decline, the government has the power, is immigration. We need to change our immigration system for lots of reasons, but one is to address and slow and reverse this demographic decline that's hanging like a specter over our nation. Our immediate goal should be to restore net migration to what traditionally has been 1 million to 1.2 million a year. Let's get back at least to the pre-COVID net migration to the United States. Then the administration and Congress should work together in a bipartisan way to expand legal immigration to the United States for both high-skilled and lower-skilled workers. And I'll talk about both of those in just a minute. A useful comparison to look at Canada and Australia. Here's two Anglosphere countries, continental size, developed countries like us. What are their immigration policies? Both of them are more generous to immigration than we are. This is immigration as a share of the population. And you see both Australia and Canada, all three countries, it's been rising, but they're significantly above the United States. And that's true not only of the stock of immigration, which this shows, but the flow of immigration as well. In fact, both Canada and Australia let in about twice as many immigrants on a per capita basis each year than we do in the United States. We could double immigration to 2 million a year, net immigration, and we'd just be the same as our two developed, democratic, Anglosphere friends, Canada and Australia. We need to reform our immigration system to promote a more dynamic and growing U.S. economy. In 2019, I had the experience of testifying before a House committee, the House Small Business Committee. They were having a hearing on immigration. And my message to the committee was simple. We need more legal immigration to the United States. That day we were talking more about high-skilled immigration. I reminded members that immigrants are good for the economy for all the reasons we've discussed tonight. Immigration reform needs to start with more visas for higher skilled workers. This should be a no-brainer. It's not in Washington. The problem with the current U.S. immigration system is not that it lets in too many immigrants. It's that it does not let in enough immigrants, and certainly not enough high-skilled immigrants, those with a bachelor's degree and master's degree, particularly in STEM subjects. Again, if you compare us to Canada, you see on family immigration, the per capita flow of immigration each year is about the same. But here in the United States, 14% of legal immigration, I'm talking green cards, are for employment-based categories. There's 61% in the other countries. Canada is let's say 9 times more employment-based immigrants each year per capita than the United States. Australia, 10 times as many. For all its flaws, the U.S. system is an effective on-ramp for immigrants to come in to the United States. Yeah, we can improve our system, but let's just let it operate the way it should and expand opportunities. We have, I know some of you in this room are here on F1 student visas. We also have the optional practical training program that allows foreign-born college graduates to work in the United States for up to 3 years. Many of those transition to H-1B visas. I have a nephew from England working for Morgan Stanley in Manhattan on an H-1B visa. And then the H-1B visa is often leads to a green card. An H-1B visa is a dual intent visa. You can pursue the green card, and then, of course, if you have a green card for 5 years, you can become a citizen. So we have a system in place to bring more immigrants to the United States. The problem is the caps, some of these. You know, friends, think how much, well, some of you can't imagine how much the world has changed in the last 30 years because you weren't here. But if you go back to 1990, there was no internet. There was no social media. The world has changed profoundly since then, certainly technologically, and yet the existing cap of 65,000 H-1B visas for high-tech workers was set in 1990, and it has not been changed since 1990. We added 20,000 for those graduating from U.S. Institutions, but otherwise that has stayed fixed. Despite the transformation of the high technology sector, where 70% of H-1B workers go to work in the high-tech sector. Let me show you another video. I did this for the Cato Institute in a short paper a couple of years ago. So the bars are the H-1B visas that Congress allocated each year. You see they were set at 65,000. They bumped up temporarily just about as the dot-com bubble was bursting in the late 1990s, and then they had that bump of the 20,000. The blue line, I call it the escalator, but that is an index of total jobs in the high-tech sector, technical services, healthcare, other sectors like that. You see how the jobs, the size of that sector has grown significantly. The number of H-1B visas has not budged. And we have a gap there. So that's a big problem. The same with green cards. The number of employment-based green cards was fixed with the Immigration Act of 1990 at 140,000. Same story. Same number of visas. And by the way, of those 140,000 visas, those also go to the spouse and children of the primary visa holder. So only about half of them actually go to the immigrant who's getting the employment visa. And again, the blue line is the growth in the sectors of the economy where employment-based immigration tends to concentrate. And by the way, those visas are limited by per-country quotas. We actually have quotas limiting the number of visas to any individual country to 7% of the total visas. It effectively works out to about 25,000 visas a year. The 4 countries that this affects, China, India, Mexico, and the Philippines. And what it means is, for those countries, we have long waiting lists, sometimes 10, 15, 20 years to wait for a visa. They're just as qualified as any other H-1B worker. They just happen to be from the wrong country. This is discrimination of a kind that we need to fix. So I made 4 recommendations to the members of the committee that day. And I'll end with this. This is my prescription for how to improve the immigration system and address the fundamental issues we've been talking about today. 1, we need to raise the cap on H-1B visas to meet the demands of the U.S. labor market. We should at least double those visas. I say triple them. H-1B workers are like gravy to the economy and to the tax collectors as well. They pay far more taxes than they use in services. And add an annual escalator like this to move it up each year depending on the labor market. 2, we need to increase the number of employment-based green cards. Again, we're operating under this cap that was set more than 30 years ago. Let's double the number of green card, employment-based green cards available each year to high-skilled workers. Let's exempt spouses and minor children. Immigrants should be able to bring over their children with them. This would increase U.S. economic growth, innovation, productivity, while slowing the decline of the U.S. labor force overall. 3, let's repeal those discriminatory per-country quotas. And, we're very divided as a country, immigration. You've seen some of that here in the Rio Grande Valley. But there is a bipartisan majority in Congress ready to vote to repeal the per-country quotas. We actually had a vote in the House a couple of years ago. 300 members from both parties voted to repeal that cap. Unfortunately, it fell victim to partisan maneuvering. And finally, and most controversially, let me end on this, and then I'll look forward to your questions. We need to expand low-skilled immigration, and I think we can do a lot of this with temporary visas. A lot of low-skilled workers traditionally have come to the United States and worked for a season, a few years, sent money home, and then gone back to their families. We need to restore that circular migration that served both countries well. Lower-skilled workers are also in demand in many sectors of our economy: agriculture, the hospitality industry, construction, light manufacturing. The number of visas should be expanded beyond the number currently offered for seasonal programs such as the H-2A for agricultural workers, the H-2B for non-agricultural workers. Right now, those visas can only be seasonal. Now, that makes sense in some agricultural sectors. I'm from Wisconsin, where the dairy industry is strong. That's not a seasonal industry. My great-grandfather was a dairy farmer there. That's twice a day, 365 days a year. They need immigrants to help produce our dairy products. And non-agricultural sectors need year-round workers. It isn't just working at resorts over the summer. We need to reduce the paperwork that makes these programs often unusable, especially for small businesses. And I think we need to limit access to government support programs. It's not good for the immigrants. It makes it politically more difficult to sell. And we've basically done that, but we need to make sure that when people come here, they work, and immigrants want to work and not become birds of the state. Let me end on talking about border security. I know you had let's say a lively primary here in the 28th district with your 18-year incumbent congressman, a progressive challenger. It got portrayed in the media as, do we get tough on border enforcement or do we enact immigration reform? Friends, that's a false choice. We can have and we need both. We need active border enforcement and we need immigration reform. In fact, the two go together. More low-skilled visas will make the U.S. border here in Laredo and across the border, it will make our border more secure. It's a historical fact that as we've increased low-skilled visas to the United States, apprehensions at the border have dropped. If we give immigrants a legal channel to enter the United States, they'll come in legally and not attempt to cross the border. Let me just show you a final couple of charts. This is by Michael Clemens at the Center for Global Development. And it shows green line is the number of visas. The orange line is apprehensions at the border, which is a proxy for illegal entries. Back in the 1950s, we had an illegal immigration problem. Congress dramatically increased the number of low-skilled visas, Bracero visas, mostly for agricultural workers. Illegal crossings of the border dropped dramatically by more than 90%. Congress abolished the Bracero program in 1964. Illegal immigration climbed inexorably. And we started to issue more visas for Mexican workers in recent years. This is just Mexican workers. Their entries dropped. And it's happening again today. This is a chart done by my Cato colleague, David Beer. And it shows the same trend. You see, when we increased the visas in the 1950s, illegal immigration dropped significantly. The visas dropped, illegal immigration went up. The reverse has happened, and it has happened in recent years with Mexican migration. All this tells me that building a wall on the border, I think it's impractical in the Rio Grande River, but walls are not the answer. The answer is more legal pathways for immigration. You know, a lot of those families coming up from the Triangle countries in Central America aren't sneaking across the border illegally. They're presenting themselves to border agents and applying for asylum. A wall isn't going to keep them from trying to get into the United States. In recent years, 50% of the increase in illegal immigration has not been from border crossings, it's from people coming in legally and then overstaying their visas. Walls aren't going to keep them out either. While we're expanding visas, we should legalize the 10.5 million already here. We need to do this with national security in mind. 2/3 of the illegal immigrants in this country have been here for 10 years or more. They're an integral part of their community, the workforce. They often have American citizen children. We need to find a way to legalize them, bring them out of the shadows into the workforce. We know from the 1986 amnesty that their wages go up. They invest more in their job and their language skills. We have better security. We know who's here. They cooperate with law enforcement. We can have them pay fines, back taxes, undergo background checks, and then we can focus our resources on apprehending real criminals and not people looking for a better life. Finally, we should start with the 1.8 million eligible DACA people in this country, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This also has bipartisan support in Congress, and yet we just can't get it done. They came here as minors. They're already assimilated. They speak fluent English. By definition, they're working or going to school or serving in the military. This is a sure bet for America to legalize the DACA young people. My final thought is this. We face a lot of challenges as a country, but those challenges will be more manageable if we remain open to the world, open to trade, open to investment, open to ideas, open to hardworking, ambitious immigrants who want to help us build a better and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for an excellent talk. What we want to do now is we want to take questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please stick up your hand, and one of our students with a microphone will bring it to you. If you're one of the nearly 200 people listening online, please type in your questions into the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Just to take the chair's prerogative, I'll ask the first question. You talked about increasing immigration, and I'm wondering what you think about the possibility of increasing fertility. What do the policies work? What kind of policies do work? What kind of policies don't work?
Well, first, I've done my share. I have 3 grown children. So I'm over that 2.1, setting a good example. And I have two grandchildren, but that's still a project in the works. But that's George, that's a tough thing for governments to do. Some countries in Europe, I think particularly a few Scandinavian countries, have tried to increase total fertility. Some of them give outright bonuses. Have a baby, here's $5,000. Some are more indirect, subsidizing childcare, things like that. Sometimes they can have a temporary increase, boosting that fertility rate by, a tenth of a point or something from 1.6 to 1.7. It has never gotten any country back anywhere near 2.1, and the effect seems to wear off. It might even be just a case of bringing some births forward, but having fewer later on. So, if I could just convince people to have more kids, I would, George, but I think it's just something government can't do very well.
Hello?
Yes.
And if they're in the audience, just pick up your hand and they can bring and we'll start bringing microphones to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent presentation. It falls in line with many of us that live and work here on the border. Many of us in this room are either immigrants, sons or daughters of immigrants ourselves. So we identify a lot of the things that you're saying and the value, and a lot of things that you're saying make sense. It's common sense, because especially those of us that live and work here. So my question, I have twofold question. Number one is that if it makes so much sense, and you've testified up on the Hill, up in Congress, and members of Congress, and you've got all these great research and studies. So what is it that members of Congress don't get about immigration reform? And number two, would you comment in regards to the current process of asylum laws, if they contribute, or are they adequate, are they not adequate, and if they are not adequate, what should we do?
Yeah. First, the messaging, and thanks for that question. Yeah, I've been working the immigration issue in Washington for close to 25 years now, and just when I think we're making progress, we don't seem to make it. So we face a challenge of helping to educate members of Congress about the benefits of immigration and the political rewards of embracing more liberal immigration. But it's an issue that's easy to demagogue, unfortunately. There's an innate feature in human nature that we can be suspicious of people who aren't like us. I think talk radio and cable TV hasn't helped, because they have an incentive to whip up resentments and anger and conflict. But I wouldn't be in this business if I didn't believe that ideas and arguments have consequences. And I do think most members of Congress, I actually worked on the Hill years ago, I've met members of Congress, they're no better, but they're no worse than the rest of us. They're just people who, as somebody said, want to have a good day at the office. And I think most members do grasp that immigration, broadly speaking, is in the interest of the United States. Polls show this. Most Americans have a favorable view of immigration generally and historically. It's just for some reason always the current wave of immigrants that cause people problems, even though we observed the Italians and the Jews from Russia and the Poles and all those folks over the years. So I think we just need to keep making the case and hope for a political climate where real progress is possible. I mentioned a couple of issues where there's majority support in Congress. The DACA young people, getting rid of those per-country quotas. Maybe some of my pro-immigration friends have said, we can't do comprehensive immigration reform, let's do incremental reform. And maybe that's the challenge right now. Let's look for incremental steps where the two parties can come together and we can make progress. The asylum issue, That's one more for lawyers. I'm basically look at things through an economic lens. But we need to make some refinements of our asylum system. We're obviously sending, we need to offer asylum in this country. It's something we need to do because we're Americans, because we have an obligation to people being persecuted in other countries. The law says something to the effect that we need to take in people who have a credible fear of persecution in their home country. And unfortunately, there's lots of people who suffer that around the world. I do think we're sending, I just mean our media and perhaps some political voices, sending a misleading message to some of those families in Latin America, in Central America, that if you just get up here, you can come in and the asylum system will welcome you in. Some of those families have genuine fear of persecution back in their home countries. Some of them, they're just economic migrants who want a better life here. That's why I think if we expanded these channels for normal legal migration to the United States, you'd have less pressure generally at the border, and you'd have less people trying to use the asylum system, which is about the only door they see that might possibly let them in the country.
Well, thank you. Congratulations, a great presentation. It was very clear to me that we have a great system if we do it the right way, that the caps are obviously the problem. Do you think those caps were put in place because of illegal immigration, to offset what they think is coming in, and maybe that's why they have the caps? And another related question is, what's the magic formula to set those caps? How are they set, or how can they be changed? Because it's obvious that for many years they've been stagnant and the opportunities are there. So what's the formula that goes into setting those caps?
Yes. Well, first off, those caps were set by a very good immigration bill. This was an example of doing immigration right. The 1990 Immigration Act, George H.W. Bush worked with the Democratic Congress to approve that bill, which very much served the needs at the time. Expanded legal immigration really across the board. More employment, green cards, more H-1B. In fact, I think it created the H-1B program for high-tech workers just in time for the dot-com boom of the 1990s. That wasn't so much related to illegal immigration, because that tends to be on the low end. Those are more the H-2A and H-2B. And those have caps too, although they can vary somewhat. And then the question is, what's the magic formula? If you go back, I think in 2020, the Cato Institute published an ebook online about some more creative approaches to immigration. And my contribution was the escalators that I talked about. I think that's the answer. A one-time significant increase in those visas to catch up with the mind-blowing changes that have occurred in our economy over the last 32 years, especially in the high-tech sector, and our exponential increase in technology capability and the need for higher skilled workers. And then, to avoid getting in the same problem 30 years from now, let's index that cap to the growth in the workforce.
I guess then it would be what happens then with automation, when automation starts taking over jobs and things like that, and maybe that escalator will start coming down, or?
It's possible, and that's if there's less demand in that sector, we'll have fewer immigrants. Immigration ultimately does respond to supply and demand, although I'll just say as an aside, I'm pretty optimistic about technology too. I don't think robots or artificial intelligence is going to put us out of work. We'll just do some different things.
Thank you. Let me take a couple of questions online, and then we'll come back to the audience again. So the first question online is from Douglas Howland, and he wants to know, do you think the move towards deglobalization will enhance pro-immigration policies in the future?
Well, if I understand that question right, I think the answer is, the term globalist is being tossed around as some insult. I don't know if I'm a globalist or not. I certainly believe Americans are better off in many ways when we're freer to engage in commerce with people around the world. To me, it's just a matter of personal freedom. I don't think the government should be telling me where I invest my money, where I buy goods and services, who I choose to work with. So I'm in favor of globalization, the freer movement of not just goods through trade, but investment, money, ideas, people. So if there's a broad, and I think this is exaggerated, I don't think the average American has turned sharply against trade and immigration and globalization in the last few years. I think it's been more certain leaders that have led some people astray. But yes, it could get caught up in that.
The next question online is from Madison Eccles, and she wants to know, is there anything that we can do as individuals to help these problems? Or is this just something that only the government can fix?
Well, I mean, ultimately, I've heard a few of you say the problem isn't here in Laredo at the border, it's in Washington, and the problem is in Washington. And Washington sets the policies. You know, people talk about open borders. That's a bit of a straw man. I think the government has a responsibility for checking who comes in. We don't want terrorists to come in. We don't want people to come in who will be wards of the state. So we have a role for government policy in setting immigration. I just want them to be more open to allowing immigrants to come in for all the reasons we've talked about tonight. What can we do as individuals? Well, most of the people in this room, you can vote. You can email or tweet your member of Congress. You can talk to your neighbors about it. You can welcome immigrants into your community, and I imagine Laredo is probably one of the most welcoming communities in the United States to immigrants, and that's one reason I like coming here. So, you know, we still live in a democracy. I'm relatively optimistic about that as well. You can influence policy. If you are pro-immigration, let your elected representatives know. You can have a primary in some cases where you can hash that out, but be active citizens. Call into those talk radio programs. Write, that's a little old-fashioned, write a letter to the editor, but make your voice heard. Tweet it out on social media. Share your pro-immigration, pro-trade views. And trust me, if the general public is going a certain way on an issue, the politicians will notice. And maybe not right away, but they will start to reflect those attitudes in what they do in Washington.
Thank you. Let's take some more questions from the audience now. And if you've got questions from the audience, stick up your hand and we'll bring the microphones to you. So let's take the next question from the audience.
Hi.
Hi.
So I know the importance in acknowledging the benefits of immigration, but you spoke about an increase of immigration and an increase in wages as they go hand in hand. And you also mentioned an increase in productivity. But from what I've seen, and what we've seen is that an increase in productivity, yet wages are stagnant. And my question is, what incentives do corporations have to higher wages when, in a sense, with, talking about an increase in immigration, there's, less pressure to higher wages or worker benefits in that sense?
Yes, thank you. That's a very important question, and that's a very lively debate in the literature about the effect of immigration on wages. There's a very simplistic view, and that is, you have an increase in supply of workers, wages have to go down. Well, the problem with that is it isn't just supply, but it's a demand. As immigrants come in, immigrants also have demand for housing, for food, for products. They increase demand in the economy, the overall size of the economy. Immigrants attract investment to the sectors where they work, and that raises productivity. So there can be short-term sort of limited impact of immigration on wages that is negative, but over 1 year, 2 years on out, wages tend to even out, and then they start to grow for the reasons I mentioned, increase productivity. So, just to summarize the literature, people like George Borjas, Giovanni Perry, David Card, they've been all involved in this debate, but there's a general consensus that immigration generally, and in particular the lower skilled immigration that I talked about related to illegal immigration, that does have a generally mild 1 or 2% effect on lower skilled Americans, particularly those without a high school diploma, and on other recent immigrants, people that are kind of like themselves. But of course, I'd say the answer there isn't to decrease low-skilled immigration. It's to help those Americans who are trying to make it in a more competitive, high-tech marketplace, help them get the education they need to realize their full potential in our economy. I think, I don't put corporations on a pedestal, kind of what I said about politicians a moment ago. People in corporations aren't any worse or better than the rest of us. They're just trying to do the best they can for themselves and their families. I think corporations are ready to pay the wages they need to attract the workers they need to produce the products, to satisfy customers and their shareholders. So I think American workers are best served by a competitive labor market. And I think we should welcome the immigrants for all the reasons I mentioned, but because they make the large majority of us more productive in our jobs and help us build a better economy, not to mention a more lively culture and better restaurants.
Your lecture is excellent. It hits a spot where we need to hear it and need to listen. Now, one thing.
You might need to flick a switch there. Make sure people at home can hear you.
Okay, talk on it.
You want to repeat the part about how good my lecture was? No, I'm
Still, Mexico has always been the relief valve for the United States. Whenever the United States got in trouble, Mexico came to the forefront and assisted this country. That's known in World War II and other times. Now, if there's some way they could measure the immigration, not necessarily everybody with the same percentage, say 2% from Mexico, 2% from Indonesia. Measure it according to the populace and where it's located, how they can help us. Because Mexico has, can, and will come to the aid of the United States when needed. The problem is the politics of the whole thing is put the stymie on Mexico as being the bad boys. They're not the bad boys. The bad boys are our crooks, some of the politicians that maybe we could, maybe we couldn't weed them out. This is where the problem is, in my point. So the point is, if we could control the rules and the regulations, lower the rules and regulations for the mom and pops, the little stores. These are the people that are hiring anybody that come forward. If we could just relieve the mom and pops from a lot of the rules and regulations they have to encounter because they have them, they don't do them. They're shut down. This is not necessarily a question, it's a statement.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. First, you mentioned small business. I mentioned streamlining the H2A and H2B. The big companies can cut through that paperwork. They just hire more lawyers for their HR departments. It's the small companies that need workers, small farmers as well. So I'm fully on board there. Mexico, if I understand the spirit of your point, I agree with you. We have so much in common with Mexico. I know we've had some conflicts over the years, but we have deep ties. And let me just say, I think, I won't name names, but I think some political figures in this country that have tried to demonize Mexican immigrants and characterize them as criminals and rapists. Shame on them. We have had a wonderful relationship with Mexico. We have tens of millions of Mexican Americans in this country who are part of the rich fabric of our country. I don't think we need to do anything special with Mexico. They're always gonna have an outside influence because they're our next door neighbor, and immigrants tend to follow worn paths of people in their village and relatives. So I think we'll always have this good relationship with Mexico. You know, the birth rate in Mexico has plunged dramatically as well. You know, people who are worried about all the immigrants coming in from Mexico, one, there aren't as many as there used to be. We've seen how that's fallen relatively. There aren't going to be any excess Mexicans to come here much further down the pike. So I fully agree with you. Trade, immigration, investment. Mexico is one of our partners and neighbors and friends in the world, and we need to treat them with the respect and dignity that they fully deserve.
Just study World War II. You will see what Mexico did.
You mean the workers that came in during that time?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They opened the doors, they pulled our acres out of the fire and saved us from catastrophe.
Yeah, that was the Bracero program that I mentioned,
Well, it wasn't the Pizarro program.
1942.
Before, whenever Camacho and Roosevelt got together and made an agreement and the doors opened, they saved our acres.
Thank you. Let me stick up your hand if you have questions from the audience, but let's move on to a couple of questions from the online audience. So the next question is from Abigail Villanueva. And what she wants to know is, when you talk to immigrants here in the United States, what do you talk to them about? What have you learned from them? Has meeting with them or talking with them ever changed your point of view on any issue of immigration reform?
Wow. You know, well, of course, I meet immigrants all the time. I've worked with a lot of wonderful, mostly H-1B immigrants or naturalized immigrants. My wife is an immigrant from jolly old England, George and I talked about earlier today. So I've learned a lot about immigrants. Again, they're people just like us. You're going to have a certain share of the immigrant population that's going to misbehave like native born. But statistics show immigrants are less likely to commit crimes and more likely to engage in positive behavior like founding businesses and filing patents. So I've learned a lot from the immigrants I've met, largely to confirm. There's some individual immigrants that I don't care for, but that's okay. There's native-born Americans I don't care for either. By the way, George, there's an interesting phenomenon that some English immigrants, you're not one of them, they come to this country and then they decide, you know, immigrants from other countries aren't good for America. So some of our most prominent immigration critics have been immigrants, a lot of them from Anglosphere countries. Just recently, I shifted from full-time work to part-time work over the last year. That's what allowed my wife and I to take that RV trip. I've been volunteering the past couple of months at an English as a second language ministry through a neighboring church. And I've met immigrants, a Uyghur who's applying for asylum, a young, hardworking immigrant who came up from Honduras and has tried to adjust his status. Anyway, they're just people like us, but to me, the immigrants I meet remind me of what's special about America. They seem to appreciate, and immigrants remind us what is special about this country because they are often coming from dysfunctional countries and they appreciate the freedom and opportunity in the United States. I think one problem with a lot of the anti-immigration sentiment in the United States is often in places in the country where they have the fewest immigrants. It's easy to kind of characterize them, whereas places where they, like Laredo, you work side by side and live and go to church with immigrants all the time, you realize what an asset they are for America.
Thank you. Our next question is from Eladi Torres, and they want to ask about for people who get green cards, who can qualify to become citizens, what's the process for that? How do you become a citizen after getting a green card?
Yeah, and actually, my wife went through this not too long ago. It took her like 35 years to decide, but then she became a citizen not too long ago. So the hardest part is to get your green card. That is the kind of the main gatekeeping we have. Once you get your green card, as long as you don't, I think, commit a felony or something like that, if you wait 5 years, you can qualify for citizenship. You have to take a citizenship test, which my wife took. By the way, it's a test that I think 80% of Americans would fail. It has to do with presidents. What's that?
Maybe 90.
Maybe 90%. I'm being generous. It's my nature. Questions about the Constitution, about presidents, U.S. history. It's good stuff. English proficiency. So if you've lived in the United States for 5 years, you'll generally speak it well enough. So in that sense, it's fairly open and not a barrier. Getting the green card's probably the hardest part of the process.
Thank you. Let's take another question from the audience.
Hi, good evening, Carla.
Hi.
My question to you is like, you were asking for a raise in the cap of immigration coming in, right? So as we've seen with COVID, like there is major amounts of immigration coming in at all times, right? And there, with immigration comes diseases, and this would also involve in other increments in other areas with other programs. And so if you're raising the cap there, wouldn't you have to raise other caps? And so then when and where is the limitation to that? Wouldn't you just come to another cap and want to raise that one as well?
So let me make sure I understand your question. Are you asking, is there any limit to the cap? Do I foresee some upward bound on immigration?
Right, because of, is there any limitations? And like, with immigration comes other problems that we would also have to raise other caps for other programs. So like, I don't find my way around with your raising cap for immigration.
Yes. Well, let me just state, kind of as a matter of principle, I think kind of society itself, the economy, will set a kind of natural cap on immigration. If there isn't opportunity here, if there aren't jobs available here, immigrants won't tend to come. You know, the straw man of open borders, we had open borders in this country up until about World War I. And by open borders, I mean, if you could get usually across the Atlantic to Ellis Island, and you didn't have anarchist criminal tendencies, you didn't have a contagious disease, and you weren't an obvious cripple or something, they let you in. And we had a rate of immigration from the old world to the new in, say, 1880 to 1914 was kind of the peak transatlantic migration that was, as a flow, as a percent of the population, it was roughly double what it is today. We could have had, instead of 1 million a year, we could have had 2 million Italians and Poles and Austro-Hungarian Jews coming over during that time. Why didn't we? It's because there was opportunity for 1 million of them, but not for 2 million. And in fact, a lot of people don't realize this, but of that mass of tens of millions of immigrants who came over during that period, about a quarter of them went back home. Life was just too tough here. So there was a kind of natural market cap on it. Having said that, I know we live in a political system, and you can't just say, get rid of the caps and let anybody come in who wants to come in. So I'm an idealist, but I'm also a realist. I think the caps about, as I have outlined them, you remember I said double it or triple it. I think that would go a long way to solving our problems. And if you had some kind of index, Takes Congress a long time, right? They haven't adjusted these caps for 30 years. So I think we would be better off, for all the reasons I've talked about, letting in significantly more immigrants. Australia and Canada do it as a percent of their population. Countries like Switzerland have a higher foreign-born population than we do here in the United States. We can absorb a lot more immigrants than we have, and we'll be perfectly fine. We'll thrive as a country. But I understand the political reality of putting a cap on it, then let's re-examine that cap.
I want to bring us back around to the beginning. I want to talk about fertility and birth rates. We talked about the birth rate. You talked about the birth rate in the United States, which I know is about 1.6 now. China had a policy for decades about reducing the population by birth control, if you will. They are now, I think they're about 1.2, I think somewhere in there, 1.3.
It's low.
So it's very, very low. I think Japan's about 1.4, 1.3, somewhere in there. But in the last 3 or 4 years, China has said, wow, that's a real problem because we don't have the workers of the future, although they've got a lot more workers than most countries. But we're not growing the population, and we're seeing declines. And so they've begun a program of trying to encourage people to have children, but they haven't moved the needle. And I think that a lot of countries who are seeing these birth declines, that's exactly what's going to happen. You're not going to be able to move that needle up, although you may increase caps, increase the amount of money for multi-children families and all of that stuff. You just won't be able to do it. And I think one of the things and you mentioned earlier that is the education level of the population. As the education level of the population grows, there's a tendency now for them to have fewer children because they're working parents or whatever it might be. And that's true of a lot of countries that have seen decline in birth rates. Europe is another example, the same thing, where you have the education and you're seeing the lower birth rate.
Yeah, that's a great point. And China's an example that, and there you've got an authoritarian government that can dictate what people do, but they can't get their population to have more kids. The one-child policy in China was, it was an economic and strategic blunder on the part of the government, a crime against humanity, forced abortions and interfering in the most basic decisions that people make about their lives. And so the Chinese government is paying the price for that horrible policy. That just gets back to my point about the geostrategic implications of population. China, for obvious reasons, can't attract a lot of immigrants. People don't want to live under that kind of government. We can't. Let's take advantage of this strategic, ace in the hole that we have. So thank you very much. By the way, I did also want to mention there's an excellent publication here, which I've read by Dennis Nixon, put out by our friends at the bank, IBC, and it's just an excellent discussion. It's been updated, but he talks about birth rates and everything from demographics to the kind of plants that grow in the Rio Grande. So I highly recommend this.
I have 2 questions left online, so since we're running out of time, I'll give them both to you, and you can decide how to divide up your time between them. The first question is from Michael Yoder, and he wants to know, are there policy ideas that combine the promotion of immigration to the US while also enhancing the origin countries, the performance of the origin countries, Mexico, Northern Triangle, etc., to develop and educate their populations? And are the goals incompatible? And then the second question is from David Lamb, and he wants to know, what are your thoughts on the previous melting pot concept of US versus now it appears possibly less interested in assimilation? What will the overall US be like in the upcoming 20 to 50 years? Weaker, stronger?
Yeah, well, first, the sending countries, there's absolutely no conflict between us opening the doors wider for legal immigration and promoting development in those sending countries. I mean, to me, it would be an absurd and morally bankrupt policy to want to keep countries poor so they send us more workers. I will say it's not primarily up to us. I know foreign aid has a role, but I think what ultimately drives development in emerging countries is their own policy. Their fate is in their hands. Do you have a system that encourages private enterprise, engages in trade in the world? We've had countries, I know you've worked for the World Bank and you know these cases better than I do. Countries that were dirt poor 50 years ago have become as wealthy as we are today. It wasn't because of foreign aid from the United States, it was because of more sensible policies, some of them recommended by the World Bank, to grow. So I think one of the best things we did for Central American countries, as for Mexico, was to open our doors to trade with them. The Central American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. That's that question. Assimilation. I'm optimistic about assimilation. America is a great assimilation machine. This is something we do much better than our friends in Europe. I think our European friends struggle more with immigration because they aren't as good at assimilating, weaving immigrants into their daily lives. In Europe, they have a welfare state that I think tempts a lot of immigrants, sometimes intentionally, to become wards of the state rather than enter the workforce. Whereas here in America, there's an expectation that if immigrants come here, they work. I think this is good for the immigrants. A job is the best social policy you can have. Produces income, it gets them out in society, incentive to improve their language skills. You know, people worry about Spanish-speaking enclaves and things like that. I just say, come to Laredo. You know, you're a city that's 95% Hispanic, and yet an Anglo like me that speaks 20 words of Spanish can come here. And this is America. It's different from central Minnesota where I grew up, but this is part of America. It just has a little different flavor than other parts. So America presents tremendous incentives to learn the English language, which is the single best tool for assimilating and becoming successful in society. Hang on to your native language of your parents or your home country, that's fine. We benefit from having a bilingual population that helps with trade connections, that sort of thing. I'll just leave you with this last statistic from social science. You know, they've studied language acquisition, and we have the same pattern today that they had 100 years ago when those Italians and Poles were coming over. The first generation, if they come here in their 20s and 30s, they struggle with the language and never completely master it. It's hard to learn language. But, and I know you'll agree with me on this, the second generation, the children of immigrants, are invariably fluent in English. How can you grow up in America and not speak fluent English at school, in social media? And by the third generation, the worry of their grandparents is they aren't speaking the language of the original country. So I'm not worried about assimilation. I'm worried that government may pursue policies denigrating certain aspects of American society. Anyway, I won't go into details, but I think if you just let people succeed in America and encourage them to work, assimilation will take place. Immigrants remind us they understand the benefits and the opportunities of America, I think, generally better than natives do, native-born Americans.
So thank you very much. We've now hit exactly 7:30, so a perfectly timed final answer. Before we go, I'd like to thank everybody for coming to the talk. We appreciate having you here, both in person and online. I'd like to thank IBC Bank again and Commerce Bank for supporting this program, to bring great speakers like you in. And of course, I want to thank Mr. Griswold for an excellent, thought-provoking lecture.